Good to go. Okay, cool beans. Well, welcome everybody to Leveling Up Your Field Game here at the Progressive Power Summit with us rising organizers. My name is Carolina, or Carilena is cool. I use she, her, hers pronouns. I'm from Maryland, but I currently live in Portland, Oregon, and I'll kick it over to Santiago to introduce themselves as well.
Thank you, Carilena. Hello, everyone. I'm Santiago Rosales. My pronouns are he, him, or they, them. I'm originally from Houston, and thankfully, over the last few years, I've been back in Houston. And I'm also here with Rising Organizers Action and excited to talk to you all about how we can level up your field game. I'll turn it over back to Carilena.
Yeah, thank you. And just a little bit about Rising Organizers Action. So, we were founded to provide free trainings to emerging activists and leaders who recognize how messed up the world is and want to do something about it. So, all of our trainings and fellowship programs are free because at times there are significant barriers to joining activist spaces, such as like trainings being expensive, or you might just feel like you need to show up with a certain degree or work experience, but you don't. All you need is passion and willingness to learn. So I see that we've already started introducing ourselves in the chat, but feel free to also introduce yourself and then put whether or not you've done voter contact or field work with Move On before. And if you have, feel free to say which races you helped with or how you volunteered. And before we get started, too, we're going to go over some of our housekeeping guidelines that I'm sure you guys have seen plenty of times before. So the first one is come as you are. We want folks to show up as their true, authentic selves. We also want to trust lived experiences. So you are the expert of your life, and others are the experts of their lives. Also, just knowing yourself. So, just making sure that you're staying in touch with yourself throughout this whole summit and taking breaks or taking care of yourself. So, if you need to go get a snack, seeking the support that you need. We also wanted to highlight the make space, take space. So, feel free to share any of your own personal experiences as it relates to the training in the chat. One diva, one mic. So, of course, if you can, please remain on mute. Any questions that you have, feel free to drop them in the Q&A section. So when you're using the chat, feel free to, again, share any personal experiences, any of your own stories, or any previous campaigns or projects that you worked on that relate to the session topic today. Feel free to also connect with each other. And again, any questions that you have regarding our training, feel free to drop them in the Q&A section. If you have a question about a certain word that we're using on our slide, feel free to drop them in the chat. But when you're using the chat, please don't use the chat to promote your own business or organization, sharing external links or other information that is just not relevant to today's content. So again, welcome. Here's our agenda for today. So we did the welcome and intros. We're going to talk a little bit about direct voter contact and field tactics. We'll do a bit of a practice and role play for you guys, talk about some data and how to capture data, and then answer your questions at the end. So the goal of today's training is just to give you a deeper sense of how field programs are designed, the choices that go into them, and how you can be the best field leader in town. So if you were a previous volunteer, thank you for all your help. But today you'll learn how to bring your voter contact game to the next level, how to engage with voters, and also get that behind the scenes look at why some of the decisions were made for a standard field operation. And if you've managed volunteers or led a field team, today, you'll learn how to quickly coach your volunteers to have deeper voter engagement, build sustainable programs, and win. So we'll jump right into it. So what is field? Field is a set of tactics used to communicate directly with voters to mobilize people and get that win. So it's where you're having that direct one-on-one conversation with the voter. So that can look like door knocking or canvassing or phone banking, so making phone calls to voters, text banking. field also helps you build and demonstrate power. So some examples of an action might be turning out voters, getting petition signatures, pushing for certain ballot initiatives. Those actions all build power within that community. Okay. So since we're talking about elections, in order to win elections, you need votes to win. So in the chat, does anybody know how many votes the average campaign needs to win? I'll give a few seconds for you guys to drop some guesses in the chat. Okay, I see 500. Okay. Well, this is actually a trick question. It's a trap. There is no average because there is no average election. There is no average campaign. You can have local elections where only 300 people show up to vote, or you can have presidential election years where millions of people vote. But regardless of how big or small a campaign is, every campaign needs to calculate something called their win number. And I see that we have somebody who posted it in the chat already. So your win number, it's 50% of a previous turnout plus 1. So you want to measure your win number off the average previous turnout from a similar election year. So for example, if I was running a field program for a candidate that's running for 2022 elections, I'm going to be looking at data not from the 2020 election, but from the 2018 midterm election. We wouldn't use 2020 election data in this case because 1, that was an election with super high turnout, and 2, those voters showing up to a presidential election might not show up to your midterm election, so we don't want to count that in or count them in. So in my example, if we had 10,000 people showed up for the 2018 midterm elections, in theory, for the 2022 election, I will only need 5,001 votes to win. Realistically, though, we want more than just 1 vote to win. Of course, it's not possible to account for every single vote, but we want to make sure that we have a large enough cushion to avoid a recount. So that's how you start building off your campaign. You use your win number as your starting point. Because our campaign has to at least contact and turn out at least 5,001 voters. So that's a lot of people, and campaigns can get a lot bigger than that. So now we have to ask ourselves, how do we get to do all that voter contact? And the answer to that is through the Snowflake model. So a great way to build your team is with something called the Snowflake model. So this was actually used on Obama's campaign. You might have seen it in other. We aren't claiming it, it's just great. The Snowflake model is a way to organize teams that connects leaders across organizations. So let's say the folks in the middle here are your core campaign leaders. They all have relationships with each other, and that's demonstrated through those interconnected lines. But they also have leadership teams that they brought into the movement, and those are the folks in green. So most of the time, campaigns will usually have volunteers lead core parts of their field program, especially as we get closer to November. So in September during GOTV, you might have some of those volunteers tackling more on from the campaign side. And those folks in green are also interconnected and have their own teams. So that's how we're all able to work together and engage in field work and build exponential field programs. So building field teams is important for reaching voters, and it's also important to build really diverse and engage in intersectional teams. There's many reasons, but I guess one reason would be because you want to have different stories from people. So my personal story and why I'm voting for a certain candidate might not resonate with you as much as Santiago's personal story and his reasons for voting for that candidate. I also want to say, like, the messenger matters. You want to have somebody from that community doing the outreach to that community. So I'll give a quick example. Last cycle, so in 2020, I was working for Minnesota State Dem Party. And so you can think of me as the person in the middle, right? A paid field organizer as one of the purple folks in the middle. I had a super volunteer, his name was Jim. So we can think of Jim as a person in green. And he was actually doing outreach to folks in his own neighborhood. And I think this is an important example because Jim was able to recruit volunteers by having conversation with folks in his neighborhood around the fact that an intersection didn't have a stop sign. So he was able to connect with folks in his neighborhood on that. Whereas if I was to do that volunteer recruitment in his neighborhood, I wouldn't be able to have that one-on-one connection with them because I don't know what's going on in that neighborhood. So that's why it's just very important to, again, build diverse, engaged, and intersectional teams. So I will kick it over to Santiago to talk about field tactics.
Thank you so much, Carilena, for giving us such a good overview of what field organizing looks like. We're going to talk about the different tactics that you can use. And I'm sure many people in this room, like me, when you first start volunteering, you're wondering, how effective is what I'm doing on this election? Like, what impact am I having so that I increase the chances of my candidate winning? The great thing is actually elections are a very well-studied thing. We have a lot of good data to tell us what the quote unquote return on investment is for all of the hours that we put into our campaigns. And I kind of want to highlight a few things about these numbers. The first is these are numbers affecting turnout. So it means this is how much each tactic increases turnout during a particular election. So you can see that these numbers are a bit small in terms of percentages, but I do want to emphasize that when you put them in the context of tens of thousands or even millions of voter conversations, they are really impactful. You're talking about multiple thousands of votes in each election are being increased otherwise above what they otherwise would have been had you not engaged in these tactics. Another thing I want to highlight, and Kenya brought this up in the chat, that relational organizing is a very important tactic. As we can see on the slide, it's one of the more effective ones. And just for a little bit of background for folks who maybe don't know the term relational organizing, it basically means when friends talk to their friends about a candidate or about an upcoming election. And this is as opposed to in the other tactics where a campaign volunteer talks to someone who they don't know. Now, I'd love for y'all in the chat to answer this question. Why do you think relational organizing has such a strong impact on turnout in elections? I'll give y'all a couple seconds to put some guesses. I love this. Thank y'all so much, Jeffrey, Rachel, everyone, for putting in these answers. Yes, the reason it's so impactful is because you have that pre-existing relationship with your friend, with your neighbor, with your family member. And so they trust you. You're a trusted messenger for them. You're also more likely to know what issues concern them. And so speaking directly to how your candidate can support the struggles that they particularly have. And so, yes, relational organizing has that powerful impact because of that pre-existing trust and relationship and understanding. Now, if we go to the next slide, let's talk a little bit more about what to expect when you do go volunteer, when you are leading a volunteer team. So as you might have noticed, for those folks in the room who have volunteered with campaigns before, when you show up, you'll notice that the campaign already has the list of people that you're talking to ready. That in campaign terminology is a universe. And I do want to highlight, as someone who worked on a campaign last cycle, that you do have different universes for each event. And you do have different universes when you're talking on the phone, when you're knocking on doors, when you're texting people. But the thing to also keep in mind from your perspective is that all of this work is done ahead of the event. So when you show up, the campaign, the organization, Move On, has already done that work. And they've identified who they want you to talk to based on a lot of intensive data analysis. And also based on where in the election cycle you are. So if you are several months away from the election, you are more likely to be talking to a broader universe of folks that includes people that support your candidate, but also potentially folks who don't. And that's a great opportunity for you to have some very fun, authentic, persuasive conversations. The closer you get to the election, though, in order to keep you motivated and energized and not burnt out, and likewise to build the movement, the people movement that you would need to elect your candidate, you might focus more on recruiting volunteers. And so, You'll switch from that persuasion stage to more of a volunteer recruitment stage. And then usually 2 weeks before the election, sometimes a little bit earlier, depending on when your early voting starts. But at the very least, 2 weeks before the election, you start switching over to get out the vote, which is when you're much more focused on talking to your supporters, talking to reliable voters, and reminding them that the election is coming up and making sure that they have all their questions asked about how to answer about how to vote. And so that is also one of those factors that plays into who you're talking to at a given event. The other thing that the campaign will provide is a script, and let's dig into that a little bit more. So usually at the top of the script, whether it's a phone script or a Canvas script, it'll have a ranking that kind of describes the different supporter scores that the campaign is using. Usually it'll be a scale of 1 to 5, with 1 being a strong supporter and 5 being a strong opponent. The other thing you might notice on the script is there might be some tested messages, such as all of your neighbors are really excited to vote for X candidate, or it might have a fill in the blank space where you could say something like, I'm voting for X candidate because they are really good about funding schools and they're really tough on people who hurt puppies. These messages are really important to keep in mind because, um, sorry, these messages are really important to keep in mind because the campaign, as we've kind of mentioned before, is an organized, data-driven organization. And so they are collecting information to see what kinds of messages really resonate with voters. And they want to use these messages to connect with a broad base of people. However, I do want to emphasize that you, as a volunteer, as someone in the community, also have a voice when you're talking to voters. And so I definitely want to encourage you to make the script your own. And in fact, on this next slide, we'll talk a little bit more about that. So as we mentioned earlier, there's different stages to the campaign, and the script will vary based on what stage of the campaign you're on. Our persuasion script is different from a GOTV script and is different from what you would be saying to folks that you want to recruit as volunteers. Now, when you want to make the script your own, the first thing you'll want to do is look to see if where in the timeline you are and what type of script this is, because that will determine what kinds of stories and personalizations you can bring in. You also want to identify if there's any tested messages, because these will be really helpful in answering maybe some common questions that voters have or addressing a particular issue in a particular community. Once you've identified what the campaign has prepared for you, then it's time to reflect a little bit and try to understand why you're supporting this candidate. It's important to pick a couple different reasons. Maybe you really align with their views on healthcare. You really align with the fact that they're from the community and they've really invested over the years in making sure that people in the community succeed. Maybe you also really appreciate their answer on climate change and how to make your community resilient towards the changing climate in our country. And so once you have those reasons prepared, you're not going to list each of these out every time you talk to a particular voter, but it is helpful to vary these because each of these issues might be the issue that the voter cares about. And so when you change it up, you increase the chance that you talk about something that's really important to the voter. The other thing is that's really important is also to make sure that you're talking to voters and getting a sense for what's important to them. When it comes to increasing support for candidates, half of the battle is getting folks to open the door and be receptive to talking to us. But the other half is to show that not only are we caring about the candidate, but we're caring about what our other community members care about, and that this is more than just electing this particular candidate, but rather building people power within the community. One thing I do want to highlight, because I know that this has come up for volunteers that I've worked with in the past, is you don't have to have the answer to every single thing that a voter brings up in these conversations. Making the script your own is really about just elevating your personal story. But if someone does ask a question that you don't know the answer to, it's always fine to say, hey, I don't know the answer to that, but I'll talk to the campaign. And actually, you know what? We have a town hall coming event next Friday. Why don't you come? You can ask the candidate the question that yourself and get a more direct answer. And so, as you can see, I pivoted not knowing the answer to a question into inviting them to further engage with the campaign. On the next slide, let's look at what a sample introduction on a script looks like. It might say something like, hi, is Carilena home? Oh, awesome. I'm Santiago. I'm here with the Beyonce Knowles campaign, and I'm here to ask, can Beyonce count on your support in this November's election? We start off with asking, is this particular voter home? Because we want to make sure we're talking to the correct person. Again, the campaign did put a lot of effort into identifying who we want to talk to. And while I will say, while we want to build a broad people power movement, we want to engage folks in our community in this election. It is worth noting that sometimes, some folks aren't registered to vote, and so talking to them might annoy them a little bit. B, there are some folks that we've identified that don't support our candidates, and so they might not want to engage in conversations with our volunteers. And C, there are also sometimes folks that have already voted, and that's reflected in the group of people that the campaign sent you to. And so making sure you're talking to the correct person is always important to do. Then, of course, the second part of that script was identifying who you are, talking to them about who you're representing, and then directly asking them if they support your candidate. So this, for sure, you'll want to read directly from the, not directly from the script, but you'll want to have this part memorized when someone opens the door. On the next slide, let's talk a little bit about the ways that you can customize and make unique the way you respond to voters. So if you have a 1, being a person that's a really strong supporter, you can say something like, wow, this is the best news of my day. Thank you so much. I'm volunteering because I know Beyonce will really do a lot of great work for our roads in our community and addressing all of the potholes we have. Can we count on you to get 3 of your friends to vote for Beyonce as well? And actually, would you also be willing to join us for a volunteer shift next week? For our strongest supporters, we don't want to just make sure that they're voting. We want to invite them to be a part of our movement, to get their friends involved. Going back to relational organizing is the most powerful tactic. If they get their friends to vote for Beyonce as well, huge impact right there. But also we want to invite them to be volunteers because it'll make it easier on you because you know that the pressure is a little bit lower since there are more people helping out. And it'll also bring other stories into the campaign. Now, if you have someone that maybe is a soft supporter for Beyonce, is undecided, or is not particularly inclined to vote for Beyonce, but isn't outright saying no, then what you'll want to do is you'll want to pivot to a persuasive a persuasive script, where you're basically saying like, I totally understand that you're not fully committed to supporting Beyonce in this election. I do want to highlight I'm voting for her because she is really dedicated towards addressing funding for education and making sure all students can succeed. Can I ask, what are some issues that matter to you in this election? And I do want to highlight, you want to be really attentive. You want to participate in active listening when a voter is sharing what's important to them. And once they've shared a little bit about themselves and what matters to them, try to see if you can remember anything in particular that Beyonce has said about that, and then relate it back to the conversation. So let's say the voter says they really care about climate change. I could say, you know what, Beyonce really cares about climate change. She's actually made she's made a pledge that her business will be carbon neutral by 2030. And clearly, if she were elected, she would also implement this as a policy for the community at large. And so it's important to connect back and show that there's a connection between the candidate and the voter to see if that helps persuade the voter to vote for your candidate. And so, and then the last thing, if your voter is a strong opponent, says they will never vote for Beyonce, thank them for their time, be courteous, but then go ahead and move on to the next conversation. I will hand it back to Carilena for our next section.
Yeah, thank you. So now we're going to get into a bit of practice. So we're going to do some role playing. So we're going to practice talking to a voter about what issues matter to them and why they should vote for our lovely candidate, Beyonce Knowles. So Santiago and I will model that role play, but if we can brainstorm together, since we're just now getting our script together, what are some reasons we might want to support candidate Beyonce? Let's put them in the chat. Again, before you start talking to a voter, you want to brainstorm some issues yourself. So I can think of a few, like Beyonce is a working mother of 3, getting the job done, and she's an entrepreneur. Why else might we support the candidate Queen Bee? Yes, love Alyssa's response there. Okay, well, while we wait, we'll get the first role play started. So I'm going to pretend I'm a voter and Santiago is going to talk to me. Switch.
I'll role play that we're talking over the phone. And Carilena just picked up the phone. Hello, is Carilena home?
Yes, hi, this is she. How can I help you?
Oh, awesome. Hi, Carilena. I'm Santiago, and I'm here with the Beyonce Knowles campaign. And I'm here to ask, can Beyonce count on your support in this November's election?
I've been thinking about voting. I've heard a lot about Beyonce,
Mhm.
but I'm still kind of unsure about her, but I've heard of her.
Gotcha. That totally makes sense. The election is still a couple months away, so there's plenty of time to do research. I do want to highlight I'm voting for her because she is a mother of three and a small business owner. And so I know that she really would have the interests of our community in mind in making sure that working parents can succeed and have access to all the support that they need. I'm curious, is there a particular issue or community concern that's really important to you right now?
I just want somebody who brings other BIPOC candidates into the fold. Like, I just want to make sure that we have representation in the media. Yeah, those are some issues that are important to me.
Oh, gotcha. Yeah, those are important, very important issues. As a BIPOC person myself, it's very important to see people like me in the media. And I will say Beyonce is actually really active about this in many ways. She is not only a Black woman that has really broken a lot of glass ceilings and uh, changed the way that Black women are portrayed in media, but she's also very much paving the way for the next generation. She, as a business owner, actually funds scholarships for folks who attend HBCUs. And so she's not only committed to seeing women like her in the media, but she is giving people the tools to do that. And so I'm curious, knowing that she is aligned with you on that and she's already been doing the work to increase the representation of BIPOC folks, does that make you more likely to support Beyonce in this election?
Yeah, I'm just so happy you called and gave me all this information because I'm going to go look up her platform right now and we'll definitely send in my ballot to vote for her.
Awesome. So glad to hear that. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. So that's okay, unseen. So that's just like one example of like, again, Santiago tying in his personal story, not really sticking verbatim to the script, but tying in issues that were important to me as a voter. So feel free to drop your reactions in the chat or if you've faced any challenges before while phone banking, because we use a really easy example. So now we're going to try and do a harder one where you might face some difficulties. So I'll pretend to call Santiago. Santiago is now the voter. Ring. Hi, is this Santiago?
Hi, yes. Who is this?
This is Carilena calling from the Beyonce Knowles campaign. How are you doing today?
I'm doing well. I'm in the middle of cooking dinner, but I have a little bit of time. What's up?
Yeah, great. I'll be real quick with it since I know you got dinner working on the stove. Well, I'm just calling to see if we could count on your support for Beyonce's campaign for president.
Gotcha. I actually don't vote. I don't feel like my vote really has much of an impact, and yeah, I don't really participate in elections.
Oh no, I totally feel that about not thinking that your voice matters. I mean, especially when politicians are acting in their own self interest, it seems like they can be above us, but honestly, they're just normal people like us. And if we want to have more people like you and me in office, we should definitely consider Beyonce for president. Beyonce is somebody from the community who's worked all her life. She started in a small girl group at a young age as a teenager. So she understands the struggles of a normal everyday person. And I believe that she can be great as president. So now that you've heard this, do you have any questions that I can answer for you or any other issues that are important to you for somebody who will be in office?
You know, I'm a little bit more intrigued. I still have to do my own research, but I actually might vote in this election. Thank you for calling and just kind of highlighting how much Beyonce is for the people.
Yeah, no worries at all. You can always check out her website, beyonceforthepeople.com. And she lists all other issues there that she's supportive. And again, she's just here, a candidate just like you and me, trying to support other people like you and me. Great.
Thank you.
End scene. So that one was a bit harder because I feel like most of the times when you have people on the phone, they try and like say like, oh, well, I have dinner or somebody else is here with me. And you kind of have to get around that by just being like, I'm only going to talk to you for a few seconds. But I know Santiago is going to get more into that later. So we'll just move ahead into data and capturing information.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah. So as we kind of highlighted earlier, we showed you that there's different effectiveness for different types of turnout. We talked about how there's tested messages that we think really resonate with voters. And the way that campaigns and organizations like Move On come up with those best practices and come up with that analysis is in the hands of all the volunteers that support them. Could we go to the next slide? Oh, perfect. So what actually happens is anytime that you volunteer, whether you're using a clipboard or you're using an app on your phone, you're not only having a conversation with the voter that you're talking to, but you should be filling out the questionnaire, the survey that they have with the different questions that they prepare. And the way that the campaigns utilize this is at the end of the day, every single day during an election, several campaign staffers and volunteers collect this data and will input it into the Voter Action Network, sometimes also called the voter file. And this is a resource that lots of organizations utilize to organize their information on voters. And the great thing about this software is not only will it take in that information, but it'll actually help you analyze your progress to your goals, your progress based on previous elections, and will help you develop the list for the next event that you're organizing. And I do want to highlight, so I'm sure many of us, we've gone to campaign events and we've wondered, well, isn't the most important thing that I just talk to the candidate? Why do I have to fill out the survey on my phone? Why do I have to fill out this survey on the clipboard? Like, what impact does it have? I do want to emphasize that all of that information you collect is the primary way that your campaign is making data-driven decisions and has just such an outstanding impact because when you fill out, say, the volunteer question, the campaign will know who are people that are interested in volunteering, who are people that are interested in yard signs. And it's also a way for the campaign to know who are the strongest supporters so that they can make sure to talk to them during the get out the vote period. So let's talk a little bit on the next slide about how to get your data right. So as we mentioned, there's a 1 to 5 scale, strong supporter, supporter, undecided being 3, 4 is opposed, and 5 is strongly opposed. You want to make sure that when you're coding people on that scale that you're doing it as accurate as possible. So a strong supporter is someone that is really excited about Beyonce as a candidate, is really excited about voting in this election, tells you, you know what, I voted in every single election. I'm going to vote for Beyonce. Don't you worry. Those are the people that we can really count on voting. And so we can put them as a 1, and we're probably not going to talk to them again until get out the vote period. 2s, people that are supportive, might say, oh, I like Beyonce, but then they don't give you a lot of assurance that they have a strong indication of voting. And so these are people that may need just a little bit more persuasion, may need a little bit more support just to make sure that they vote. But we want to indicate that they are very receptive to voting for Beyonce. 3, it's someone that says, you know what, I'm not decided yet. I'm still doing my research. Those are the people that you want to keep talking to in your persuasion universe throughout the campaign to see if you can move them into a 2 or into a 1. 4, I will say, as someone who's worked on campaigns, it's not super common to talk to 4s once you've already talked to them. These are folks who might be like, I don't think I'm going to vote for Beyonce. So a little bit less undecided and a little bit more opposed. But it's worth noting that these are folks that maybe we could go back to because they weren't aggressively opposed to talking to us. They weren't aggressively opposed to Beyonce. Anyone that says, no, she will never have my vote, I don't vote for Beyonce in any election, you go ahead and mark them as a 5. they'll be removed from the future conversations you have with voters. There are also usually some status indications you can say. So you could mark maybe someone wasn't home. You can mark that the line was busy. You could mark that someone said, don't call again, that they refused you at the door. Or if there was a dog or a locked door, a locked fence, something that prevented you from actually reaching the voter's door, you could mark that as inaccessible. And there might be other codes that the campaign you're volunteering with has that is using specifically, but these are just some common ones that you might see. And then, oh, and actually, one thing I will highlight, especially for folks who do volunteer and split in communities that are bilingual, sometimes you will see one that says Spanish. So if you're an English-speaking volunteer, you interact with a voter who only speaks Spanish, that is an important one to mark because usually the campaign, if they have Spanish-speaking staff or volunteers, can make specific canvases to go back and talk to those voters. So that's just one small instance of how your data is literally powering the campaign's next move. Could we go to the next slide? So let's tie it all back together. Let's synthesize everything we've talked about. And first, we do want to highlight safety first. You are volunteering for campaigns, or even if you're working for campaigns, it is important that you feel safe, that you feel comfortable, that you feel empowered to be talking to voters. And it's worth kind of setting the expectations. So many voters, even folks who are opposed, are going to be nice to you. They're going to be courteous and they're going to say, thank you for your time, but I'm not interested. Or thank you, you're really great. I'm so glad that you're out here doing this work. The ranges will vary, the responses will vary, but there's a lot of people that will be nice. There are people that won't answer the door. And then there are people that are less than nice. A couple things to highlight. You never want to go into anyone's house. And I'll also highlight, you don't want to go into anyone's car. And I say that because on one of my first block walks, there was a person who was very enthusiastic about my candidate and said that they were going to take me to where a lot of voters for this candidate would be. And I made the mistake of going in their car to those locations. I realized that at the end of the day, that was a mistake. I was very lucky that nothing happened, but learn from my mistake. Don't go in people's cars. Don't go in people's houses. At the same time, you're representing the campaign. You can share about your story, you can share about yourself, but don't share your personal details, especially if you don't want to. And if you feel that you're being harassed, immediately report that to the campaign. They will take whatever appropriate actions are necessary. The other thing I want to highlight is you really want to make sure if you are managing volunteers, if you're managing staff, there's a wide range of folks in this room, that you also consider what the expectations might be for new volunteers and kind of just prepare that, set them up for success. If you have a first-time volunteer, if you have maybe volunteers that in this particular neighborhood might feel less comfortable, I do want to highlight that an important system that I used on a lot of my campaigns was the buddy system, where you send people off in pairs. Not only does this make people feel a bit more comfortable, but it also makes it more fun, because then all of a sudden you're working with someone else. You're kind of trying to see, who's having the best conversations, who's getting closer to finishing their packet. I also do want to highlight that if you do have canvassers of color who might be racially profiled, depending on like the dynamics that you perceive in the neighborhood, it's important that not only does every volunteer have your contact information as a volunteer leader, but in particular, you want to make sure that you just have the contact information as well of your volunteers in case you need to check on them or anything. I actually, last election cycle, did have a volunteer who had the cops called on them. They did call me after the cops had talked to them, and I talked to them, reassured them that what they were doing was legal, sent them another list that they could go to if they felt comfortable. And a lot of it was just making sure that they felt okay, that they felt safe, that they felt comfortable, but also reassuring them that they couldn't get in trouble for what they were doing, because all of this is protected by the First Amendment. So I give all of these examples just to highlight that if you are sending folks out into the field, you just want to be prepared so that no matter what, your folks feel supported at every moment. Could we go to the next slide?
Oh, there we go.
So if you take away nothing else from the presentation, but take everything else away, but if you take away nothing else, these are the points that we really want to highlight. The first is you always want to have authentic conversations when you're talking to someone. It's very possible. I always tell this to my volunteers. It's very possible you might be the only person during the entire election cycle that actually talks to the volunteer. Sure, other campaigns will call them and text them, but maybe you're the only campaign volunteer that they picked up the phone for or that they opened the door for. And so you want that conversation to shape how they perceive your candidate voting in this election and really excite them as much as you can. And authentic personal conversations are those impactful driving conversations that get people to take action. I also want to highlight, and this is something that I learned while I was volunteering, every matter, but it's also a little bit of a numbers game. You're not going to get every supporter. There are going to be people that are apathetic towards the election or your candidates. But the important thing is that you're a voter that's on your list because that increases the chance that you'll have those exciting conversations where you've made a difference. I also want to emphasize campaigns have to talk to so many voters. They're always understaffed. They always need more volunteers. So volunteer as much as you can and bring your friends, bring your family, make it a social activity as well. And then the last thing, your script, it's a guide. It's tested for that community, but if you're also part of the community, you know what resonates. And so balance both the speaking from your story, speaking from your experience, and speaking to the values of the campaign. And with that, I'd love to turn it over to see what questions y'all have. Excited to see what y'all are wanting to learn more about.
Santiago, I think we do have one, and it's in the Q&A section. So if you have any questions, drop them in the Q&A section, please. But we'll start off with this one, which says, what would you say when people are apathetic to voting? And I think we might have lost Santiago, so I'll go ahead. Oh, they might be back. I think we lost you for a second there. Can you hear us okay? Okay, good. Okay, so the question was, what would you say when people are apathetic to voting? And I can answer this first. I would say it's very important to figure out the reason of why they're not voting. I was canvassing with a volunteer last year, so the 2020 elections, and they said that they weren't voting because they felt like there was too much of an emphasis on the presidential ticket. And I had to remind them, just because there is a presidential one and this is a presidential election year, that doesn't stop local elections from happening. There are still down ballot candidates that we need to pay attention to. There are still ballot initiatives that we need to see whether or not we support or not. So I think that's just one example for me, particularly that, I came across that apathetic voter and was like, listen, I get it, all this, new or attention on the presidential one, but you really need to show up to the polls because you have this person running for state senate, or this person can lose their seat in the state house and we need to keep them there. So that's how I would respond to that. Santiago, do you have anything you would like to add?
Two things I like to keep in my pocket for those kinds of questions are, it's usually good to have an example of an election that was really closely decided and one vote made all the difference. In 2017, I believe was the year, the control of the Virginia legislature literally came down to one vote and a coin toss. That's how the winner at the end of the day was decided. Had one more person voted for the Democrat in the election, there would have been a slim Democratic majority in the legislature. And so that's literally what it came to. Every vote really does matter, especially in those local elections. And I also like to emphasize the importance of local elections and how much of a difference that makes. I like to bring up that there are people on city council, there are great people that are county DAs, there are great people that are mayors that are doing exceptional things to improve non-controversial things like roads, bridges, schools, broadband, water access. But it's important that those people, that you vote for the people that you align with, because who is taxed for those improvements and which neighborhoods get those improvements sometimes comes down to the candidate that's elected. And so just remind them that, if they want to see improvements to their community, there is a candidate that's fighting for them. And that's your plug to say, and that's my candidate.
Yeah, that's a good answer. Yeah, and I would just say hone back to maybe your own personal story, and like that will move them. Like I know I was working for local elections, and the candidate that I was working for was one candidate that was really good about making sure that there was affordable housing units, and I know that was something that was going to directly impact my friend. So I had to tell them that story of like, you know, my friend's life is on the line here. They might not have housing units available for them. So this is why we're supporting this candidate. And, you know, if you bring your personal story into it, hopefully it will sway that voter a bit more too. Are there any other questions that we might have? I think we only have a few more minutes here left in this session.
I don't see this having come up just yet, but something that I know I usually train volunteers on, and I'd imagine you did as well, Karilena, is what do you do if a voter is trying to rush you? Like they seem like they're really busy and maybe they don't have time for the conversation. Do you want to go in that first?
No, it's okay. You can tackle that one first.
So one one thing I like to tell my volunteers is, well, actually, I tell my volunteers two things. One, voters don't really know how long the conversation is going to take. They usually think that it's going to be like a half-hour conversation, an hour-long conversation, when in reality, as a volunteer, you want to talk to them, you want to have an authentic conversation, but you also have a packet of 40 doors. So you can't spend your whole time talking to one voter. And so what I like to tell my volunteers is when a voter says, hey, I don't have time, sorry, I'm really busy, just saying something like, you know what, I totally respect that. I'll give you the short version of this conversation and then give the regular version of the conversation, because it's a reassurance that you value the voter's time. It's a reassurance that you understand that they're busy, but it's also a reflection that our scripts really are meant to be quick. They're meant to be efficient so that you're able to talk to as many voters as possible. And so it is true to say, I will give you the short version of this. And I've seen it work wonders. Like people will stay on the phone, people will keep the door open in order to talk.
And if you have any lit like for your candidate, I usually am like pointing to the lit. I'm like, oh, and this candidate votes for this, this, and this, and go through the talking points with them on their pamphlet and say like, any questions on this? And then hopefully that will buy some more time for them to like, okay, well, I guess I do have a question on this one point on that pamphlet. Hopefully we'll bridge that conversation a bit more. But great. Well, we have 3 minutes left, I believe, but I don't see any more questions. So I'll just switch it over to our thank you slide. So I just want to say thank you guys so much for joining our session today and asking great questions and interacting with the chat. I had a blast being here.
Yes, I enjoyed it as well. I do want to highlight if you're looking to learn more about personal storytelling, your personal narrative, I know one of our great volunteers had mentioned that there's an upcoming session. So I just want to plug that again, that it's always good to get practice on how do you tell your story in an impactful way. And so definitely recommend that training.
Yeah, more personal story. Your story adds power at 11, which is coming up here now. But great. Well,
awesome.
I guess we'll leave it at that. Well, thank you guys so much.
And thank you so much to our volunteers who kept the chat organized and active. We really appreciate you all as well. And thank you, Karilena. You were amazing.
Yeah, thank you too, Santiago. I love doing this with you. Thank you all so much. See you guys.